Here we're at a house that was exposed to the crown fire that extends all the way around except for down the canyon from the house. And the first impression when you walk in here is that the crown fire obviously caused this house to burn down, and that this house didn't stand a chance. But the one thing I want to point out right away is that there's quite a distance, well, there is a distance of clearing between the trees and where the house is located. And I also want to point out the things that are remaining, the things that are unconsumed in this scene that are between the house and the crown fire as we pan across. There's absolutely no doubt but what this was an intense fire environment at the time that it burned. It burned extremely intensely. Now we'll go up and we'll take a look at those things that still remain between the destroyed house and the crown fire to see if we can get a sense of maybe what the heat exposure was to the house from this crown fire, and maybe get a clue as to, at least categorically, what burned this house down. As you can see, we've got things that are left between the house and this crown fire, and that can give us a clue as to what the exposure was to the house from the crown fire. That is, how much heat the house was getting from this crown fire. The first thing we'll look at is this rototiller. And the thing that I concentrated, well, the first thing that I did was I made sure that the rototiller wasn't moved out here after the fire. So the indication there is the stuff that is unburned right in a line up there. So I determined that this was here during the fire. They had moved it out because it's got gasoline in the tank, still has gasoline in the tank. And one of the things that I noticed was the foam hand grips. They're somewhat melted, but they're not totally melted. And the plastic in the ends are not melted, and nor is this plastic brake grip melted. And these are highly vulnerable to high intensity heat. They would have been dripping off, they would have totally been melted away. The next thing that I looked at to give me a clue as to how much energy, and oh, by the way, let me just mention that this rototiller is about 40 feet from the house, and it's about 45 feet from where the first trees are for the crown fire. So this didn't receive enough heat to melt the things that are highly sensitive to the heat. So we've got a clue here that this house didn't receive sufficient amount of energy in order to ignite the wood siding. Well, let's take a look at something else, another side of the house, and I want to show you something over here. Now, 9 days ago, this was wilted and green. That is the strawberries and the tomatoes, and there's a gradient here. There's a diminishing amount of scorch all the way to just nothing but wilt in this garden. Here, close to the crown fire, we've got the plants scorched and burned. And as we move across the garden, we see that we move into a location where the plants were just partially scorched and mostly wilted, to the point of where we get to the tomatoes. And although you can't really see it now that it's been almost 2 weeks later, there was no scorch on these tomatoes. There was only wilt. Obviously the tops were killed, and there was deformation on this PVC, this polyvinyl little garden picket, but there was no significant melting. So that is an important clue also. It takes much less energy in order to to deform and to melt vinyl than it does to ignite the side of this home. The next thing that I want to show you is over here, this wood glider. And that's a real important clue for this side of the house. Now we've covered really one side of the house that faces the crown fire. Now let's take a look at another side of the house that faced the crown fire. The wood glider on this side, and the question is, well, was it here? And indeed it was, because we can see the footprint here where it had been sitting while the crown fire came through, and this was all green, by the way, instead of just that little patch under the foot. So in fact it was here. And this side of the glider that's facing the crown fire isn't at all scorched. And this is about 60 feet from where most of the crown fire was, from the edge of where most of the crown fire was. But when we go onto the house side of this glider, we notice that the burning of the house was sufficient to cause the glider to continue to burn and finally burn through it at one of the points, and the house side legs actually fell over. Now what that also tells us is that this house was burning considerably after this crown fire passed through the area. What ignited this house and burned it down were the little things. Now I don't know exactly what those were on this house, but the little things, the pine needles up next to the wooden deck or on the deck, perhaps even patio furniture. You'll notice that they've got patio furniture here on what was the deck. If there had been cushions on that patio furniture, that could have caught firebrands, ignited, and burned the house down. As you can see, the crown fire came down the creek and was a pretty continuous crown fire. Came across in front of the house over here, as well as on this side roughly to the west of the house. It's a pretty extensive front of crowning. Don't know exactly when each of the locations crowned, but it's a pretty good exposure. But the one thing that gives us a clue that the house was of sufficient distance from the crown fire is that there is some remaining vegetation that's unconsumed. It's certainly scorched, but it's unconsumed, which gives us a bit of a clue that the house had a chance of surviving, at least from the standpoint of igniting the wood. So let's go up to the house and take a look at what characteristics may have contributed to that survival. Okay. The first thing we've got that we can see is that there's a considerable amount of irrigated vegetation around the house. Also, you can see in this particular area we've got a rock berm. It's non-flammable. We've got the sidewalk all the way around, and up in here next to the house we've got vegetation that doesn't really represent fuel. These irises here really don't represent a fuel, even though we've got wood right here. Nevertheless, these were irrigated, and yes, they wilted and have since, over the last 9 days, turned yellow. In other words, we can still have plants next to our house without them necessarily being fuel. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is if it's attached to the house, it should be considered part of the house. In this particular case, when we've got wood steps and wood decking and stairs, we want to make sure that we understand that this is as much part of the house as the house itself. So what we want to make sure of is that we've got irrigated lawn or vegetation that doesn't represent fuel up next to it. One of the things that I want to point out on this house that's important is that they allowed sprinklers going before the fire came down, just prior. So there was a great deal of this that was wet. This is an important point because people, if they have the water supply, in fact can put their sprinklers on, wet things down, which definitely inhibits the firebrands, the flying embers that can potentially ignite this. And in this particular case, that would be the problem with this house. And that is we've got a lot of active crown fire that's producing a lot of lofted material, burning embers that can shower down on this house and ignite multiple places around the house. And that's what we really want to be conscious of. With those people putting the sprinklers out, it just guaranteed that anything like this that might have been fuel ends up being wetted such that it's no longer fuel. The next thing that I want to look at is this, the ponderosa pine that we've got here. Now, in and of itself, it doesn't really represent fuel. It's by itself. It's a long way away from the crown fire. There was scorching on it, but one of the huge problems with a tree like this is that it deposits a tremendous amount of fine dead needles around the house as well as on the house. In this particular case, this house has gutters. It has a gutter system which can, particularly on this side of the house where the tree is overhanging the roof, the roof is composition shingle, so that's not a problem with it igniting from needles, but the gutter, if it collects needles, it can ignite from those lofted embers, and it can start a fire right there at the eave edge, right where the roofing comes down. And let's go around to this side of the house. Now this is really an important characteristic on this house. See how this is pushed out here? This is wood up under here, and we've got siding coming down. This is an excellent thing to do. Basically, you just remove all the vegetation, all the potential fuel, and you take it down to something that's totally non-flammable. This is an incredibly vulnerable place on this house if we have any fire underneath here. It's not vulnerable from that big crown fire out there that didn't catch this side on fire anyway, but if we have anything that's burning under here, this kind of a push out really traps fire, and once it can generate even glowing combustion, it's very likely that will penetrate into the house and involve the entire structure. Okay, let's go around to the backside, take a look at the backside. Okay, here is another good example. We've got wood plywood siding with a wood drip, but we've got masonry wall, concrete foundation, and very little vegetation, very little anything that is going to create any flames that are going to ignite this wall. It's basically a very fire-wise situation. This grass doesn't burn with enough flames to actually bridge across and produce enough heat to ignite the wall, and not only that, but anything that might ignite in here, including piles of firebrands that you can see here. This is concrete and masonry wall, and it really isolates this wood wall. And this wall is significantly far enough away from any of the torching trees up there to keep it from igniting. One of the things that I want to point out here with this boardwalk is, once again, if it's attached to the house, it's part of the house, which means that if this outbuilding here was highly susceptible to ignition, as you'll notice that they've got it rocked around the bottom so that there is no vegetation, no flammables next to that structure. Not only if that structure was burning would it jeopardize the house because it's so close, but it could ignite this wood walkway, which over the amount of time that the conditions existed could come down the walkway and right into the house. It would take maybe hours to burn this house down, but when people came back, they would find their house totally destroyed, just for something like this. Well, Sonny, here we're at an area of houses before potentially a fire is going to be coming here, and we'll be taking a look at how these structures might fare with fire. We'll start off with this wood pile. Remember before I mentioned that anything that's attached to the home is part of the home. In this particular case, what we're looking at is a huge amount of wood that is cribbed here underneath a protection, but it's pretty much attached. In this particular case, it's to the garage. And this garage is in high jeopardy, even though they've got no vegetation and a rock foundation which protects really the log structure. And we've got quite a bit of clearance from the potential canopy the canopy that might potentially ignite. Nevertheless, we've got the wood pile here that can catch firebrands that are lofted, potentially ignite that, and that pretty well dooms this entire structure. Well, as we go along from the wood pile, which is not a good idea to be where it's at, and we move along, they've been doing some activity in here. And the activity of cleanup is a good idea, but one of the things that really needs to be a concern is to not focus so much out there on the forest that you start missing little things. It's the little things that also matter, and lots of little things. One little thing, for example, might not be a significant problem, but lots of little things, it's a little bit like a crapshoot. A small item is a low probability, but as you increase the number of items that can ignite and potentially ignite the structure from that, you just have a higher likelihood of it burning the whole structure down. So for example, here, there's been wood cutting activity going on, doing some clearing, but a lot of the chips have been left right here underneath the wooden doors. And this potentially, it's pretty dry material, and it's been broken up so that it potentially could be an ignition bed for firebrands, for those lofted burning embers. And if this flames, it can begin then to catch in this treated lumber. And it may not burn right away, but because of the way the door is here, it can begin to burn in the cracks, burn on both sides of the door, and a few hours later, consume the structure. They've put rocks in along here that help out with regard to, you know, potentially blocking fire from coming in here. But one of the things they haven't done is they haven't screened under this decking. And as I mentioned before, the decking goes all the way around. Well, if we look at this garage, it's also physically attached to the home back here. So this garage represents this home. Well, one of the things that can happen is that we've got a wood plate here that's holding this brace that holds the rest of the deck, and there are pine needles that have accumulated. In fact, lots of pine needles have accumulated, which can potentially then ignite, work its way up inside, potentially catch the deck on fire, this walkway, and which can then potentially catch the home on fire, either through the garage or just follow the decking around. But here we come to the firewood pile right on the front porch, and this is definitely a problem. You know, it's amazing how during a heavy firebrand fallout, of what I call a firebrand blizzard, how these wood piles just continually catch on fire, just everywhere. And so this is a very serious problem. Let's go over here and take a look at some of the landscaping. One of the things that occurs with junipers, and this really isn't too bad because it's been well irrigated and it's still pretty small, and also it's far enough away from the house where it's probably not a problem. But there are a lot of places where much larger patches of juniper than this are right up against the house, and the huge problem is, take a look at all the dead material in here. The firebrands come in, they fall down, and they have a perfect mat of dead vegetation with which to ignite the rest of this shrub. Well, we've got some interesting possibilities here with these junipers. The first thing is, let's take a look at this one. The junipers here, they've got a little bit of dead material underneath them, but I don't think that's going to be a huge problem. But the one right next to it is an example of how these junipers can get. It's, I think, a serious enough example to where we can look at it and get a lesson from it. Look at all the fine material up underneath here. And of course, we're bending over and getting in here, but it takes nothing for firebrands to lodge under here and ignite this. Look at the dead grass and the juniper needles that have deposited in here. This is a perfect ignition bed. This juniper can then begin to burn. Well, this green canopy is close enough to this wood wall to where there easily could be flames touching this wood wall. And most likely that's going to be enough to ignite this house. Now we have some other nooks and crannies that we need to pay attention to. We'll start here at the window ledge with this inset window. One of the things that really needs to be attended to is any deposition of needles that's here in the window ledge. This can catch firebrands potentially. The needles have been dropping in here and depositing, which means that if needles drop in here and deposit, that's also going to be where firebrands can drop in and deposit. So the firebrands drop in, they begin to ignite the fine fuel bed of the needles, and that starts igniting in the cracks of the window box with this fascia. But take a look at this. Up here in this crevice, we've got all kinds of material that's collecting right here in between this box and the side of the structure. Lots of fine fuel in here to catch firebrands, ignite. Lots of cracks in here. We've got you know, lots of gaps in here for it to continue to ignite, even large wood chips. So this is an extreme problem. And if a fire came through here, ignited on this, burned the structure down, we'd look at this afterwards and wonder, how did this occur? Well, we've been talking about the walls and the base of the house. We haven't really hit on the roof yet and the things that adjoin the roof. Now, in this particular case, we've got a metal roof, which is non-flammable. If this roof were anything other than flammable wood and, well, in some places even thatch, believe it or not, the roof is essentially non-flammable. But you know, one of the things that's very interesting, if you look, now this is a very steep roof, and so there isn't anything that's deposited right up here next to this wood wall where the roof adjoins the wood wall. But I've seen in some cases where the roof isn't as steep a pitch and there will be trees overhanging the roof, and it'll deposit needle material right up there on the roof next to that wood wall. And that needle material can then ignite from firebrands and potentially start that wood wall on fire. Most of the destroyed homes that I've examined didn't ignite from the big flames of the crown fires that passed through the area. They've mostly ignited from the small ignitions on and around the home. That means that the homeowner can do the things that are necessary to help their home survive those wildfires. Is that there's quite a distance, well, there is a distance of clearing between the trees and where the house is located. And I also want to point out the things that are remaining, the things that are unconsumed in this scene that are between the house and the crown fire as we pan across. There's absolutely no doubt but what this was an intense fire environment at the time that it burned. It burned extremely intensely. Now we'll go up and we'll take a look at those things that still remain between the destroyed house and the crown fire to see if we can get a sense of maybe what the heat exposure was to the house from this crown fire, and maybe get a clue as to at least categorically what burned this house down. As you can see, we've got things that are left between the house and this crown fire, and that can give us a clue as to what the exposure was to the house from the crown fire. That is, how much heat the house was getting from this crown fire. The first thing we'll look at is this rototiller. And the thing that I concentrated, well, the first thing that I did was I made sure that the rototiller wasn't moved out here after the fire. So the indication there is the stuff that is unburned right in a line up there. So I determined that this was here during the fire. They had moved it out because it's got gasoline in the tank, still has gasoline in the tank. And one of the things that I noticed was the foam hand grips. They're somewhat here we're at a house that was exposed to the crown fire that extends all the way around except for down the canyon from the house. And the first impression when you walk in here is that the crown fire obviously caused this house to burn down, and that this house didn't stand a chance. But the one thing I want to point out are right away melted, but they're not totally melted, and the plastic in the ends are not melted, and nor is this plastic brake grip melted, and these are highly vulnerable to high intensity heat. They would have been dripping off, they would have totally been melted away. The next thing that I looked at to give me a clue as to how much energy, and oh, by the way, let me just mention that this rototiller is about 40 feet from the house, and it's about 45 feet from where the first trees are for the crown fire. So this didn't